Hi, everybody, and welcome to CTV's coverage of the California primary election 2014. I'm City Councilmember Fred Gaines.
And I'm City Council Member James Bozajian.
And we're going to go through analysis of how Calabasas has voted in the 2014 California statewide primary election. James, what's the big headline story from the 2014 primary?
Well, I think there were a couple. This was the first gubernatorial election cycle where we had both the top two primary and an open primary where the top two vote getters go to the general election regardless of how many votes they got. I think the number one story is the fact that there was such a low voter turnout, a record low turnout, and that also the Republicans did pretty well, better than most people expected. And both of those things combined to make for some interesting and surprising results in some of the races.
And my top story is, who is David Evans? And who is David Knuth? And we're going to talk about that in a little while as we go to these results. But let's start with that story, the turnout in California. The previous record low turnout for a primary gubernatorial election, 28%. That was in 2006. And here we're looking at a statewide turnout of about 18%. Why?
Well, we should mention that there are several 100,000 ballots still to be counted, so it's going to go up, but it will be a record low even with all those ballots counted. The reason? A couple reasons. First of all, you had no hot races, no hotly contested races that caught fire during the campaign, so there wasn't a lot of excitement generated by the candidates. And also, I think it's reflective of the fact that California's become basically a one-party state, and so there's just a general lack of competition in the state between the two parties. You had no propositions of note on the ballot to bring out people to vote. That sometimes raises the turnout, so that's why you had such a low turnout.
Well, we are seeing this time and time again now. Our Calabasas city election, your Los Angeles city elections, now we're talking about a statewide primary election, all 20% or less in terms of turnout. And you do start to question, at what point do we really need to reinvigorate this voting system, because people are choosing not to participate.
Well, we used to complain about our voter turnouts. Our municipal election turnouts are higher now than California's primary election turnout. LA County was 58th out of 58 counties in its turnout, dead last with almost 5 million registered voters. Alpine County, with 766 registered voters, had a 70% turnout. So it's really hard to say what the reasons are, but clearly, especially locally, and you can see even in the highly educated, highly participatory area that we have that normally turns out pretty heavily for these elections, we weren't much above the average in Calabasas and the local communities.
And these low turnouts do skew the outcomes of these elections.
Because more partisan voters, more liberal and more conservative voters, they almost always go to the polls in greater numbers. Republicans go in greater numbers than Democrats, and so you have some results that were a little surprising as we'll go on.
Well, let's move on to the election results. And we did have an election for governor. You might not have heard much about it. James, what are you looking at in terms of our numbers on the gubernatorial election?
Jerry Brown dominated the entire election, although to a lesser extent locally. Neil Kashkari and Donnelly were pretty close statewide, but as far as locally, it was a much different result. Kashkari won the local cities by 2-1, 3-1 margins. It was kind of interesting. What do you make of that?
Well, I think our Conejo Valley region is not exactly a Tea Party stronghold, and as you would expect, you're going to see a more moderate voter, both on the Republican side and on the Democratic side. So in a choice between a more Tea Party-leaning candidate, Donnelly, a more moderate candidate, Kashkari does a lot better in our local area than statewide, and Donnelly does not do as well.
I mean, neither of these candidates on the Republican side were very great standard bearers, and it's been since 1966 that an incumbent California governor has been defeated in an election of this type. So I just don't think that it's going to matter too much. I think Brown's pretty secure. It is worth noting that I think Tim Donnelly would have polarized the electorate more, and that is not good for Republicans in a state dominated by Democrats. So the Republicans probably got the better of the two between the two, although they're very likely to lose by a significant margin.
Jerry Brown's going to win this race, but hopefully there'll at least be some debate. Let's debate issues like the bullet train and tax policies and some of the things, and I'm hopeful that we'll see that in the fall election, even though we're pretty certain what the outcome of that's going to be.
Yes. Now, in the lieutenant governor's race, there were no surprises there. Certainly, the Republicans don't have a terribly strong or well-known candidate. Naring was in the state legislature for a while back, but Gavin Newsom wins by varying margins locally. But he looks pretty solid in this contest.
So one of the unusual things that happens in this low turnout election is we get some very interesting down-the-ballot elections, one of them being Secretary of State, where we had a very interesting big field and some interesting results.
Yes, it looks like a dead heat between Padilla and Peterson, who are the top vote getters. And, this is one of the two races that Republicans may be competitive in November. It's very possible. Peterson's a pretty decent candidate. He did very well locally. He beat Padilla locally, and I think there's some interesting things with the next two candidates.
Well, Alex Padilla, of course, state senator, former LA City Council president. Pete Peterson is a professor at Pepperdine.
Yes.
Runs their Davenport Institute, which is a academic center for civic involvement. So two candidates that are actually should get put on a very good race. But you certainly had some other interesting results. Here's a statewide election where the third place finisher is a disgraced state senator under indictment who dropped out of the race a couple of months ago. He still polls into third place, polls almost 300,000 votes, and in maybe the biggest irony of the race, the indicted state senator finishes ahead of Dan Schnurr, former chair of the Fair Political Practices Committee, and Derek Cressman, the former chair of the State Common Cause.
Yes. Schnurr might be the most qualified candidate for this position. He's been involved in politics his whole life. He was a close confidant of Pete Wilson. He's been a Republican operative. I think what might have hurt him is that right before the election, he switched to independent because he felt he'd be more electable as an independent, and he lost his base. There was really no one out there supporting him. So he finishes in fourth place, and it goes on for, I think, a relatively close contest between Padilla and Peterson.
Still very hard for an independent candidate to gain ground in an election. People are still tied to their party idea, Democrat and Republican. And frankly, with the lower turnout, your hardcore Democrats and Republicans are showing up, and your decline to states and your independents, even though that's a larger proportion of the voter base than it has been in the past, they're not coming out to vote in these elections.
You're right. You're absolutely right. Now, the oddest result of the evening, in many people's opinion, was what happened with the state controller race, which remains undecided, where slots 2, 3, and 4 are divided by a few thousand votes, and where they've gone back and forth as new votes are counted from late absentees and provisionals. Ashley Swearingen, the mayor of Fresno, comes in first place, and she is probably the Republican with the greatest chance of winning in November, if a Republican is going to win. In fact, she may win almost by default if two Republicans, which would be considered unheard of in most elections, but here in California. But in this statewide race with a high Republican turnout, you may get two Republicans in first and second. But what about David Evans? Who's that?
David Evans. David Evans is the biggest surprise in California electoral politics that I can remember. Here's a statewide office, a competitive statewide office, where you have the Speaker of the State Assembly, the Mayor of Fresno, a sitting state senator running along with other candidates, and David Evans, who no one honestly had ever heard of. You and I were discussing, we're both students of this, and the day before the election, I couldn't have told you who David Evans was.
Me neither.
And he, all night long, was running in second place. When we went to bed on election night, he was a couple thousand votes into third. As we sit here today, a couple days after the election, he's back into second place, into the runoff for the fall. He's the former mayor of California City, California, which is a little teeny town up in the northern Antelope Valley, Mojave Desert area. He's a CPA. He spent $600 on his statewide campaign, absolutely nothing. And he was running in second, almost 700,000 votes that he's gathered across the state of California.
And this just goes to show that sometimes people just look at a name, and David Evans sounds like a very pleasant sounding name, and that's what I think happened here. I don't think people actually researched it and decided they agreed with him on the issues. He didn't articulate. He wasn't able to. He spent a few $100s on his campaign. Very cost-effective campaign, by the way. Republican candidates also did very well in Calabasas and the local cities. I noticed that. And the final thing I note here is I think Betty Yee would have finished perhaps in second place. Is probably worth at least a few thousand votes, that she shared a name with the indicted state senator who had to withdraw from the other race. I think that people don't do a lot of research and homework, and they have negative associations with certain names.
But the interesting thing is, who comes in second place is going to have a big effect on that
It
fall
will.
election.
Absolutely.
If this is Schweringen versus Evans, the two Republicans, Ashley Schweringen, the mayor of Fresno, likely victor in the fall.
Yes.
If Perez gets sneaks ahead of Evans, John Perez, the former speaker of the state assembly, then it's a Democrat versus a Republican, a higher turnout election, and you got to give the odds are with him that he's going to carry through, even though he had trouble running TV ads, by far the biggest campaign budget, and he's running in third place as we speak today against two relatively unknowns, one completely unknown.
Well, turning to the state treasurer's race, no surprises there. John Chung wins. Many thought he was the incumbent. He's actually the present controller, moving over to state treasurer, likely the winner in November as well against Conlon. In the California Attorney General's race, this is fascinating. First time ever we've had a local Calabasas resident, I think, run, much less win. He stuck his name on the ballot, spent less than $1,000, Ron Gold. Another situation where it was an uncompetitive race and someone had to come in second place. Now he gets to run statewide. Interesting factoid about Gold, he actually ran for the Calabasas City Council in 1991. The original incorporation election, came in 8th place out of 13 candidates. So he couldn't win a seat here on the City Council, but he could win a position for the general election in the California Attorney General's race. Thought he might get more votes locally, but he did not do appreciably better here than he did statewide.
State Insurance Commissioner David Jones and State Senator Ted Gaines, again, pretty much a straightforward Democrat-Republican breakdown, 55-41.
I think a lot of people thought that was you.
I don't know, Ted Gaines, Fred Gaines, I don't know. He's a Republican from Northern California. I'm a Democrat from Southern California, but people were obviously confused in this election.
Yes, they were.
Ballot people. And finally, with our statewide offices, the State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tom Torlakson, running TV ads, one of the few candidates in this cycle to actually be on TV all across the state, and he came in first place. But Marshall Tuck, another Democrat, considered more of a reformer. Torlakson considered more closely tied to the teachers' unions, Tuck to the charter school reform movement.
And more moderate.
And more moderate. You could see did very well in Calabasas and in some of our local cities.
Torlakson won statewide by 18 points. Tuck actually won most of the local cities, or at least was competitive in the local cities. I think there's going to be a very close race in November, potentially.
With the Republican out, you have to assume a lot of those Republican votes may go to the more moderate candidate, Tuck, so that could be a close race. That's our statewide races.
Yes. Let's turn to the U.S. House of Representatives. Our district, the 33rd District, an open seat, 18 candidates, Fred, and a split vote, but 2 candidates have emerged as the winners. Go ahead.
Well, this is what happens when you're, after 30, 40 years in office by Henry Waxman, the seat is open. There's a lot of pent-up demand for people who want to run for Congress, and we had 18 candidates, including a half a dozen who raised, substantial money. We're even on TV in this district, a crazy district that goes all the way from Calabasas through Malibu, all the way down the coast to Palos Verdes Peninsula and inland to Beverly Hills, one of the wealthiest districts in the country. And in our new top 2 system, you have, and with 18 candidates, the Republican, sort of the only viable Republican, you and I were predicting was going to come through. Even though it's a heavily Democratic district, there's enough in a wide seat like this to have the Republican do well, and in fact come in first place.
Yes, he did very well.
Yeah, Elon Carr, who's a very good candidate, former military officer, prosecutor, has relationship with the Jewish community, a lot of good aspects here. But whether he can win a district that still has, as you can see from the voter registration, a 2-to-1 Democrat to Republican registration is yet to be seen.
And here you see a real variance from Calabasas from the overall district results. Carr did exceptionally well here. He got 28% of the vote, which is amazing with so many candidates. But look at the difference between Liu and Gruhl. It was a really competitive race district-wide, but in Calabasas, Gruhl dominated. Liu is a state senator from the Torrance area. He served on the Torrance City Council. And so he had the southern part of the district almost to himself among the major candidates. And he racked up huge margins down there, did not do much campaigning up here, and Gruhl did. And she was eclipsed by him throughout the district. The other noteworthy things, none of the other candidates really emerged from the pack. Marianne Williamson, the independent, formerly a Democrat, spent more in her campaign, excluding outside expenditures from independent expenditure committees. She spent more than any other candidate. And she only got 11% of the vote in Calabasas, 13% district-wide, falling short. And then you have Knuth. What about Knuth?
David Knuth, who was out here, had a booth at our Earth Day festivals. First time I ever met him. No one's ever heard of David Knuth prior to this election. Raises almost $1 million, runs TV ads, gets 1,000 votes. Almost $1,000 a vote. I haven't seen anything like that in all my years of covering this. $1 million to get 1,000 votes. And then we talked earlier about David Evans, who nobody heard of, who spent $600 to get 700,000 votes. Okay, so he was getting 1 vote. He was getting 1,000 votes for every dollar. Knuth was getting 1 vote for every $1,000. This is the kind of bizarre results you get when you have these kinds of open seats in multi-candidate races and very low turnout.
And it remains to be seen whether in a 2-to-1 Democratic district, whether this will be a competitive race. I think not, but one never knows. Turning to the State Assembly, our State Assembly district, the 45th district, Matt DeBobne defeating Susan Shelley by an 8-point margin. A little bit different than the special election last November, where DeBobne beat Shelley by a single percentage point. We had to wait a week to determine who was going to actually win that election. I think that the power of incumbency plus the higher turnout relative between the special election, which had a lower turnout than we even had this week, I think that combined to give DeBobne a little bit more breathing room. And also, there wasn't a difference between how the district voted and how Calabasas voted, unlike last time where Susan Shelley dominated Calabasas. Your thoughts?
Well, this is how the low turnout skews these results. When you had a special election just 6 months ago for this seat with a 9%, 10% turnout, while the registration in the area is 2-to-1 Democrat, the voters on election day in a 9% turnout election are 50-50, and that election was 50-50. It was a 300-vote margin between these two candidates. And that was also in a case where the Democrat had a lot of money, was mailing and doing, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars. Shelley had some campaign, but certainly not a big money campaign. So here you double the turnout to 18 or 20%, and you get more of what you might expect in this race, an 8-point spread. And frankly, if we go to a 25 or 30% turnout in the fall, I would expect that this margin may even increase a little bit.
Maybe a little bit.
A little bit for
She's a good candidate
DeBobne.
for the Republicans to run here. If you look at the county races, which we're now going to turn to, we have for the first time in modern California history, all the county-wide offices that were up, all 5 of them were open. and it made for some interesting races. 4 of them wound up being competitive, and we'll go to the November elections. Out here, we have the Board of Supervisors seat open after 20 years. Yaroslavsky retiring, and we had a spirited campaign in the 3rd District, primarily between Sheila Kuehl, longtime former state legislator, and Bobby Shriver, who was on the Santa Monica City Council for some time. And what are your thoughts here?
Well, this is going to be a very interesting race. I was surprised. I wasn't necessarily surprised that Kuehl came in first. It could have been Shriver or Kuehl. I expected it to be a little closer.
Yes.
And it was in Calabasas, but it was 6, 7, 8 points in district wide. I think that'll be a lot closer as we get to the fall. People knew that this was going to be a runoff. They were saving a lot of their bullets. This is going to be a big money race. It's a very important seat. You have Sheila Kuehl representing a lot of different interests in the area, Bobby Shriver from the Kennedy family, and so you're going to have a lot of activity on this going into November. It's going to be a very interesting race to watch.
And of course, unlike partisan races, if somebody gets over 50% in a nonpartisan county race, they don't have to go to a general election. 2
key things to watch here. John Duran and Zev Yaroslavsky. John Duran ran 3rd here, a strong 3rd. Former mayor of West Hollywood City Councilman, had 17% of the vote. We'll see where he goes if he endorses in this race. And the incumbent Zev Yaroslavsky has stayed out of this race.
That could make a difference.
And whether he comes out with a endorsement in this race could also be very important in how this race turns out. One last point. I know we keep talking about turnout. Here we are in Calabasas, and despite the fact we have an open congressional seat with 18 candidates, first time it's an open seat in decades. We have an open supervisor seat with a number of candidates, big name candidates, spending money. All of that activity didn't bring us, and in fact we have a lower turnout than we've had ever in history for this kind of election. Very interesting how even despite those kinds of open races that people have said, I'm not taking the time to vote.
Okay. In the Los Angeles sheriff's race, you had almost someone winning outright out of 7 candidates. Jim McDonnell with a very strong showing, I think a stronger showing than expected, 49% of the vote. They're still counting. He may slip over 50%. I think it's reflective of McDonnell's outsider status. He's the chief of police out in Long Beach. And what with all the problems within the sheriff's department that were highlighted in the press recently, and highlighted and punctuated by the dropping out of Lee Bakken and his resignation earlier this year, I think that helped him. He also had a very broad base of support, a very diverse base of support throughout the county.
I think people feel it's time for a change in the sheriff's department, and they flocked to the candidate who was considered a little more of an outsider, which is Jim McDonnell. Since the election's over, only a couple days out, 4 of the other 5 candidates have already endorsed McDonnell. And like you said, he was only a few thousand votes away from taking it without a runoff. So he's going to be the very, very, very heavy favorite in November.
Turning to the assessor's race, this is another race. It's wide open. The current incumbent assessor spent much of his term in jail awaiting trial on a number of felony counts. He's now out on bail awaiting that, and he's taken a leave of absence for most of his term. So there's been turmoil in the assessor's office as well. Jeff Prang, longtime West Hollywood City Council member, and has held a number of other county-level positions, facing off against John Morris, longtime deputy district attorney and now head deputy district attorney in the DA's office. Close race between them, Fred. I think it's likely to be very competitive and spirited. Prang edged out Morris countywide, and Morris defeated Prang here in Calabasas.
And this will be a competitive race. Morris, endorsed by the LA Times, has more of an outsider type of reputation. Prang, endorsed by many of the elected officials and the Democratic Party, and so we'll see how that turns out in November. And another one of these races where the vast majority of people who go to the polls in November will probably have no strong idea what they're thinking on that race.
In the House of Representatives in the 26th district, that's the district just west of Calabasas, it gets some press coverage here. This is one being watched by both national parties. It's considered one of the swing districts and one likely to flip, or at least possible to flip. Here's a result of a high Republican turnout, I think, and a very evenly divided district. Julia Brownlee, the incumbent, gets 46% of the vote. And the Republican challengers, there were 2 of them, and a conservative independent get the rest of the votes. Jeff Gorell, longtime state assembly member, gets 44% of the vote, finishes right behind her. I think she's in trouble, Fred.
Oh, absolutely. This is going to be a $10 million race because this is a potential pickup, Republican pickup from a Democrat to a Republican. Nationally, that has very important implications in the House of Representatives. Nationally, they don't talk about California very much when they're talking about swings in the United States Congress and in the House of Representatives, in the Senate. But this race is going to be watched because it is a district that is typically thought of as a Republican district. Brownlee came in last time and was able to win that race. She wasn't from that area. She had to move into that area to do that. Gorell is, you say long-time assemblyman. I guess under term limits, if you've been in for 4 years, you're a long-time assemblyman.
6, I think.
Is it 6 years?
Yeah, he's
okay.
been 6.
But and much of that he was on duty in
That's right.
In Afghanistan.
Well, it doesn't help him with. It doesn't hurt him with the voters.
No.
You know.
And very popular with the voters and a good, solid candidate. And the money is going to flow into this race nationally because of its importance as a swing race, as compared to, for example, the race here in Calabasas, where we're going to have Carr and Lieu. People are going to assume that Lieu, as the Democrat, has a tremendous advantage in that race.
I would say he has a
and
distinct advantage.
Unless something happens with Lieu or Carr really shows the ability to make this closer, you're not going to see the investment in that race. You're going to see it in this next door race with Brownlee and Gorell.
What are some of your final thoughts looking toward November?
Well, Jerry Brown's going to be governor of the state for another 4 years. The Democrats are not likely to have a 2/3 majority, certainly in the state Senate and maybe not in the state Assembly. They still will have wide majorities, but that 2/3 majority that allows them to basically override on budget and any other types of votes, it looks like they're going to lose that. There's several other races around the state where the Democrat looked like they were in trouble based on the primary results. So on the one hand, this new top 2 race does seem to be bringing us a little more moderate of a candidate. It does seem to be supporting the more moderate person in some of these races. But overwhelmingly, how much further can you go in terms of lower turnout? I mean, when you're going from 28% to 18% to 13%, last year here in Calabasas we had a 9% turnout election. You're getting to a point where we really have to figure out a better way to do our voting where people are interested and available and desirous of participating.
And my final thoughts are Republicans did very well in this election. They're likely to reclaim, as you indicated, their 1/3 plus 1 unsuper minority status in both houses. They might pick up 1 or 2 statewide races. Just like with the controller's race, there were a few races in legislatively that their top 2 candidates were Republicans in the 25th congressional district between Strickland and Knight. Both Republicans. Democrats thought maybe they'd play there in November, but they're not going to have a candidate due to the turnout levels. And again, I think the turnout will be relatively low. It'll be higher in November than it was here, but relatively speaking for a general election, it'll be low. There's not a lot of competitive races statewide, if any, and I'm not sure there are going to be that many propositions on the ballot of significant interest. So that's what I would expect for November. Maybe someone can work on turnout and how you increase that, because it really doesn't do the public a great service to have completely unknown candidates pop into a general election just because they have a name that sounds better than the next guy. And I think it's a problem to be worked on in the long term. In any event, I'm James Bozajian, Calabasas City Council member.
I'm Fred Gaines, Calabasas City Council member.
And we'll be back in November to give you the results of the general election then.